Good evening and welcome to tonight's STS-133 mission status briefing. With us again tonight is Royce Renfrew, the lead flight director for the International Space Station on this increment. We'll go first to his statements and then we'll take questions here at Johnson Space Center and on the phone bridge. Royce?
Okay, thank you very much. So we had another great day on orbit, getting the PMM squared away, ready for the crew undock later on Monday morning. Had a crew news conference that went very well. Lots of good questions from all over the world. People talking to the ISS crew and the crew Discovery at the same time. We've been pounding through our mid-deck transfer. We're about 90% complete. When I last talked to ACO transfer a couple hours before the end of my shift, it's my expectation that the mid-deck transfer is pretty much all done. We don't actually have any scheduled for tomorrow. We still have our late stow activities on the day we close the hatches to get the last couple payloads that need to get thrown across the hatch at the last minute. We'll do that. Today in the PMM, we had a very successful day. I told you yesterday we were going to go in and get a lot of the launch hardware squared away and try to get the PMM into a configuration for ease of use on orbit as opposed to all the launch locks and the various equipment that we have to have in there to protect the hardware when Discovery comes off the pad. So today we removed a bunch of that launch hardware and got Express Rack number 8 relocated into the lab. There was a couple questions in the crew news conference about that. It was right there where the crew was doing the PAO event. We also spent some time playing with the zero-G stowage racks. There are 3 of them that we focused on today in there. One of those will eventually go into the Columbus module, and the other 2 will be deployed in the PMM. They're actually kind of interesting pieces of hardware because they're really just fabric racks that come up, folded up, and then when they get on orbit, we push them out so they take up the volume inside the rack, and we can put soft stowage items in there as well. Did a little bit of stowage reconfig, and that's just a fancy way of saying that we took some of the components that came up in the PMM and started scattering those out around station. So all in all, a great day in the PMM. I know you guys were watching the crew in there most of the day. We also spent some time in the airlock with Mr. Bowen and Mr. Drew, getting the airlock squared away and getting their EMUs ready to transfer back to Discovery when they come back home. Essentially putting all their tools back away and getting the airlock in a good config for nominal stage ops. The last tag up we had with the crew, we were essentially reporting that the tool stow was complete in the airlock. And they also did a little bit of work on a couple of conversations between the crew in the airlock and my EVA officer, troubleshooting Al Drew's WVS, his helmet lights that came off in EVA2. Had some questions about the way we installed those previous to coming out the hatch, so we're narrowing in on hopefully a solution as to why they came off and be able to prevent that from occurring in the future. Let's see, tomorrow is a very busy day again on orbit. We're going to do 3 major activities tomorrow. The first major activity is a continuation of what we've been doing for the last couple of days, in that we will continue in the PMM and get the last little bit of launch hardware taken off the racks and get those racks in a good configuration for on-orbit stay. And we will also spend a little bit of time tomorrow in HTV2 getting some food out of there that's stowed in HTV and probably transfer that over to the PMM. We'll also move some ballast around in HTV and get it prepared to take some of the launch hardware that we've been disassembling in the PMM to get it transferred over to HTV2. It's important to maintain the center of gravity in the vehicle, obviously. And when we release it, we want to make sure that the center of gravity is correct, and that'll require us to move some equipment around in HTV2 to get that ready to go. Second major activity that we'll be doing tomorrow, Commander Kelly will be in Node 3 installing what's termed a remediation kit into the oxygen generation system. That's part of our regenerative ecosystem. We take water that is produced on board ISS by taking condensation and crew urine, and we clean that up, and some of that water gets transferred over to the potable water system for the crew to drink. Some of that water also gets transferred to the oxygen generation rack, and we split that down into its component parts and pump the O2 into the ISS and dump the the hydrogen overboard. Right now, the OGS has been down for a while, waiting for a kit that we were bringing up on 133 called the remediation kit. When we launched, originally we were going to install the remediation kit in the stage, but now that we've added a couple of days to the docked mission, we're going to take advantage of those couple of days to offload the stage activity, install that remediation kit tomorrow. Really, it's a filter that we're going to install in there, much like you might have a filter on your faucet in your home at home to clean out impurities in that water. And it also has some chemicals in there that we want to flow through the rack to reduce the pH balance in there and get it back down to where we want it to be, so we can start using that OGA again. And then the third major activity that we'll do tomorrow, we'll have Paulo and Mike Barrett working on the lab carbon dioxide removal assembly, or CEDRA. During EVA 1, we actually had a failure in the lab CEDRA, and we've narrowed that down to what's essentially a short in the heater beds of that CEDRA. The carbon dioxide removal assembly essentially sucks atmospheric air into the CEDRA, and then uses a heating process to bake out the carbon dioxide so we can clean the carbon dioxide from the air. So there are really just heater pads in there. One of those heater pads apparently has a short in it, and we're going to go in and operate on that particular heater pad tomorrow in that front CEDRA bed. This is actually a good thing for Mike Barrett to do, because he did exactly the same activity during his increment. We had a very similar signature. We took a CEDRA bed out, cut into it. Mike Barrett, the doctor, used some scalpels and whatnot to cut the insulation foam off that CEDRA bed. And then we're going to spend a little bit of time figuring out which wire to cut by using a multimeter and testing all those wires. We'll eventually find the right one that's shorted. We'll go in and snip that and put that back into the lab CEDRA and get that back up and running. Incidentally, my ECLS officer was the same ECLS officer that did this with Mike previously, so we've got the band back together here, and I was the flight director on console when Mike did that in his increment. So apparently having Mike on the vehicle with John Garr and myself on console was a bad thing to do, but we'll get all that squared away again tomorrow. Let's see, the HTV, just to forecast out there a little bit for folks, the HTV release on March 28th, after Discovery departs on Monday, we'll get HTV relocated back down to the Node 2 Nadir port on Thursday, March 10th, and we move that out a couple days with the extension of the mission. So we'll get that relocated, and then we'll, on the 28th, we'll release it from the Nadir port. The question I had yesterday about when we were going to get Robonaut out. So after Discovery undocks on Monday, and then we're going to relocate HTV on Thursday of that week, we're going to give the crew a couple days off in between there because we've been working them really hard. So we won't get Robonaut out until after we relocate HTV down to the Nadir port on the 10th. And we'll get that done between the 10th and the 28th when we're going to release HTV. And that's really all I have.
Okay. Thanks, Royce. We'll start here at the Johnson Space Center with any questions that you might have. Mark?
Mark Carreau for Aviation Week. I just wanted to follow up on the OGA work. So has it been sporadically operational, and this puts it back in the fold, or how long has it been disabled, or whatever the state is now?
Okay. We've been looking at a lot of the data off of that, and we actually haven't had OGA up and running for, I don't remember when we turned it off. We partially use it and operated in a not full capacity whenever we needed some O2 on ISS, but we've been waiting literally for this remediation kit to arrive on 133. So we want to get those chemicals into the system, get the pH balance squared away, and get that filter in the system before we power it back up. So we haven't really been using it. We really don't need it. ATV brought up a bunch of O2 for us in its tanks, and we've transferred a bunch of O2 over from Discovery to the ISS tank. So we really haven't needed to use the OGA up to this point, but we want to get that squared away so we can make our own O2 rather than having to use those consumables that have come up in the visiting vehicles. So hopefully we'll get that all taken care of tomorrow.
And just to follow up on the CEDRA bed in the lab, so does this bring up, I'm not very I'm trying to remember whether there's 2 beds in that one too, and 1 bed's been working, so this makes it fully functional, or can you just clarify that, please? Thanks.
Sure. All of the Cedars have 2 beds, and the one in the lab, we just turned off it has 2 power switches upstream of the 2 strings of heaters in both beds, so that we saw a short on one side and we went ahead and unpowered that side. So the lab Cedar is still running, but it's only running with one side of its heaters active right now. And after we take the bed out and find that short, clip that wire, we'll be able to put it back in and activate both strings of the heater power, so we'll get a little more efficient unit out of it.
Okay. Philip, and then come forward to Rob.
Philip Sloss with NASASpaceflight.com. I may have misheard this, but I thought I heard over the commentary that the Vosduke went down. Could you just provide a quick status and what's the go forward plan from here on that?
Yes, right at the end of my shift, Mr. Edelin had come in with his Orbit 3 team, and we were handing over my RIO officer reported to me that Vosduke went down. Talking to my SRP over in Moscow, they've decided not to do anything with it this evening, and then they'll talk to the crew in the morning and take a look at that and see if they can get that back up and running.
Thanks. And a question on the O2 transfer from the orbiter to the station. How close to full will you get with the O2 transfer on this mission?
The ISS tanks will essentially be full. It's a little bit difficult to describe, because if you think about the heat that's applied to the outside of the stack, that has the effect of expanding the gas in those tanks. So if we're at a solar beta where we're getting a lot of heat on that side of the airlock, it shows that there's more in those tanks because the pressure goes up. If we're at a solar beta where the sun is not shining on those tanks on that side on the airlock, the pressure goes down. So we average all that out. So I can't give you an exact number how many pounds of O2 we have on ISS, because it literally changes day by day. But in the math that my ECLS officers calculate there, we'll essentially leave the ISS tanks full before Discovery departs.
Thank you.
Hi, Robert Perlman with CollectSpace.com. Just a quick question, just to follow up what you said about Robonaut. So barring any unforeseen problems, Robonaut will be out and about by the time Endeavour's crew arrives in mid-April. And will it be active, or will it just be set up out of its packaging?
Okay, so we'll have it set up, and then there's a relatively extensive checkout period that we have to do on Robonaut, and we'll incrementally increase the number of the tasks that they do. So obviously, the very first thing that we're going to do sometime after we've relocated the HTV and get in, unpack him, is obviously just set him up, and then we'll turn around and power it on, and some folks over in Marshall will be looking at the telemetry on it. And I can't forecast how long that'll go on before you ever actually see Robonaut move. But obviously, we'll spend a lot of time just checking out the system and see how it behaved after the forces that we put on the Robonaut when we launched the vehicle. So they'll spend a lot of time checking it out, and then sometime in the future, we'll start incrementally increasing the activities that Robonaut does. He actually has a breadboard that he plays with where we command it from the ground for him to do things like take something out of a specific socket and then move and then put it back in. And then as we increase those technical difficulty of stuff that he'll do, he'll start behaving more like you would expect a human to move. But that'll be a long way down the road.
Just to follow up what you just said, are all his commands going to be ground driven, or at first, or is the crew going to be able to use him much like they use spheres on orbit?
Right. The crew actually has capability of operating Robonaut from on board. The first stuff that we're going to do there, obviously, one of the resources that we always track is crew time. So we want to do all of our initial checkout just to make sure that Robonaut is ready to go. We'll do the majority of that from the ground, and then if we need the crew to help us do one or two things, turn a bolt here or check a circuit there, that we'll get them involved in that. But the majority of the work that we'll do to begin with will be commanded from the ground.
Okay. I think we had a question over here.
Thanks. Pete Spots with the Christian Science Monitor. Just a couple of quick ones. One, could you just sort of recap a bit the problems with the oxygen generator that these repairs are aimed to solve? And the second one is just quick. If this repositioning of Robonaut or unpacking Robonaut after you move the HTV, does that represent any sort of acceleration of the timetable, or is that basically how you scripted it all along?
Let's see, question one. One of the things that we're bringing home on 133 is what's called a hydrogen dome. That's part of the OGA system that failed previously. In the PMM, we flew up the packing for the hydrogen dome, and the crew relocated that relocated that packing out of the PMM to Discovery's middeck and took the failed hydrogen dome and put that in Discovery's middeck as well. So that's the piece of hardware that failed originally, and that was due to what we think is the chemical imbalance in the water that's going through that hydrogen dome. So the remediation kit and we had a spare one on board and we installed that, but we've been not operating at the OGA at maximum capacity because we think the chemicals in the OGA itself need to be adjusted, which is what the remediation kit is going to do. So what we didn't want to do is fail our other hydrogen dome that's currently installed. So we're bringing one home, and we'll look at it when we get it on the ground. We'll install the remediation kit tomorrow, and that should square away the chemical imbalance. And as I said, it's kind of a little filter itself to make sure there are no impurities in that water going in there. And we'll fire it up hopefully tomorrow evening, and we'll start it back up and see how it's behaving. And then your second question about the period of time between unpacking Robonaut is whether or not that's accelerated. It's actually not. It's pretty much where we thought it was going to be. We want to get it done in the stage after it arrived, obviously, so we can start checking it out and make sure we can start operating it. If you think of the Robonaut, it's another science payload. So we have what's really a science payload on the vehicle that we want to get active as soon as we can so we can start using it. So doing it after 133 undocks and the HTV relocate. We originally had to relocate HTV because we couldn't get the PMM and the ELC out of the payload bay with HTV on Node 2 on the Node 2 nadir port. So the relocation of HTV is a little bit of a wrinkle in the activation of Robonaut, but that's okay. We'll take the extra couple days to relocate HTV and then get on with the activation of Robonaut in the stage following.
Okay, more questions here. Marcia Dunn on the phone bridge, do you have anything?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Hopefully I answered your question there, Marcia.
Yes, you did. I'm on a cell phone, so I just wanted to make sure I heard properly that your best guess, unless the crew gets to it sooner, is to unblock Robonaut between the 10th and 28th of March. Did I hear correctly?
That's correct.
All right, thank you.
We want to get the foam he's packed in HTV so we don't have to deal with it. So we need to get him unpacked prior to HTV release on the 28th.
You know, Katie Coleman said earlier today that they might even try to hurry it up before that. Will they have time on their plate to even consider something like that?
You mean during the docked mission?
Yeah, or soon afterward.
You know, we were struggling today. They were just doing so good today. We were staying one step ahead of them, and I usually like to be 10 steps ahead of them. So this crew is very fast, so I would not put it past them to be able to knock out everything we've given them to do and to maybe get into that earlier. But per the timeline, we're going to do it after we relocate HTV before we release it, so somewhere between the 10th and the 28th.
Thank you very much.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, any further questions here in Houston? Seeing none, well, thank you for being here this evening. A couple of programming notes. The crew sleep is going to start at just a few minutes at 5:53, and then the Discovery crew will go to sleep at 6:23. And then tonight's flight day highlights are being pushed back by an hour to let us get the best video in there, and they'll be beginning at 8 p.m. Central Time. And then overnight at 12:45 a.m. we'll have our International Space Station Flight Director update. With that, we'll close out our briefing. Thanks again for being here.